The autumn wind curled gently through the foothills of Boulder, Colorado, rustling golden leaves as they drifted past the windows of the Evans home. Inside the modest two-story house, once a chaotic haven of toys, lab notes, and family dinners, Margaret Evans stood in the kitchen, hands deep in bread dough, sleeves rolled up to her elbows. The scent of yeast and rosemary filled the air, an echo of traditions she'd started decades earlier, even as her heart and mind remained ever tethered to molecules, trials, and petri dishes. She was 63 now, her auburn hair graying at the temples, though her mind remained sharp, disciplined, alive. For nearly 40 years, she had balanced the razor-thin edge between motherhood and medical innovation. To the world, she was the co-founder and chief research scientist of Evans Therapeutics, a quiet but powerful engine of breakthrough cancer treatments. To her children, she was simply mom, maker of chicken soup, fixer of scraped knees, and defender against monsters, real or imagined. But it hadn't always been so balanced. In 1985, Margaret turned down a tenured position at Stanford and another at NIH. It shocked her mentors. "You're walking away from your future," one professor had warned, bewildered. But she hadn't walked away. She had walked toward something else, toward a dream she shared with her husband, Robert. He was a brilliant clinical pharmacologist. She was the biochemist with the instinct to see what didn't exist yet. They believed in creating something that wasn't just lucrative, but human. A company rooted not in quarterly reports, but in compassion, for patients with cancer and the families left behind. The early years were brutal. They started the company in their basement, then moved to a drafty warehouse on the outskirts of Boulder. There were weeks when they didn't pay themselves. Their children, Andrew and Lena, grew up surrounded by centrifuges, white boards scribbled with molecular formulas, and the sound of lab timers beeping instead of lullabies. Margaret often worked through the night, a baby monitor next to her lab bench. She once calibrated an assay with one hand while bottle-feeding Lena with the other. When Lena took her first steps, it wasn't on a playground, it was between stacked boxes of reagent kits. Margaret kept a photo of that moment on her desk, not because it was cute, but because it meant something. A reminder that even in the exhaustion, even in the chaos, it had all been for something greater. There was one memory Margaret returned to often, an anchor in her sea of responsibilities. It was a cold December evening in 1996. Andrew was 10, Lena just 6. Snow blanketed the windowsills, and power had gone out during a storm. The lab was shut down for the night, and the family huddled by the fireplace, candles flickering. Margaret had just received confirmation of a successful trial, EV12, a new compound that reduced nausea in chemo patients by over 70%. It had taken 2 years, hundreds of late nights, and 3 failed prototypes. The success was monumental. It would become their first commercial product. But that night, there were no celebrations. No champagne. Just the 4 of them on a rug, playing Monopoly by candlelight. Andrew had noticed her distant stare. "Are you thinking about the lab again?" he asked, half teasing. Margaret smiled, brushing his hair from his forehead. "A little." "Did you fix it?" Lena asked, always curious. "I think I did," she whispered. Then Robert leaned over and took her hand in his. "You didn't just fix a molecule, Margaret. You made something better, for real people." It was in that moment she realized what they were really building. Not just a business, but a legacy of care. Not just formulas, but relief. In 2002, when EVT12 received FDA approval, Margaret stood silently at the press conference, content to let Robert take the microphone. She never liked the spotlight. She found power not in applause, but in quiet certainty. What mattered wasn't being seen, it was being useful. By 2010, their company had grown to over 150 employees. Margaret had led the development of 2 additional patented treatments, both hailed in the medical community as game changers. Still, she never missed a school recital, and dinner at the Evans household was sacred, even if it meant she had to return to the lab at midnight. She taught Lena how to wire a microscope and Andrew how to organize a lab notebook. When the kids had nightmares, it was Margaret who sat beside them, whispering stories about tiny warriors called T cells that protected the body from invaders. She never told them that sometimes the body loses. There were setbacks too. In 2015, a Phase 3 trial collapsed due to unexpected toxicity levels. Investors panicked. Robert lost confidence. Margaret didn't sleep for a week. But even in failure, she showed up. "Science doesn't care about your timeline," she once said to a junior researcher. "It cares about your patience." As the years passed, her role evolved from hands-on to strategic. She mentored younger scientists, established ethics committees, and fought, quietly but ferociously, for patient advocacy policies inside their clinical operations. Yet through it all, Margaret carried an unspoken dream, that when the time came, she would step back gracefully, handing the reins to Andrew and Lena, trusting that they understood the soul of the company she had helped build. She imagined herself becoming a quiet advisor, walking the gardens behind their Boulder HQ, offering occasional guidance, maybe even writing that book she never had time for. But dreams, like cells, mutate. What she didn't yet see, couldn't yet predict, was that the very children she had raised to be strong, ambitious, and capable would one day see her as expendable. That the man who once said, "We made something better," would begin to think she had given enough. That all her quiet work, her long nights and small wins, might be seen as part of the past instead of the foundation of the future. But that part of the story hadn't arrived yet. At 63, Margaret still believed in the integrity of science, in the unbreakable ties of family, and in the slow, patient labor of building something that outlives you. She didn't know that soon, her faith would be tested in ways she never imagined. For now, she placed the bread dough into the oven, wiped her hands on a dish towel, and looked out the window toward the foothills where the light was beginning to fade. In the distance, the lab building stood tall, sleek, glass, humming with the energy of projects she had once birthed from scratch. Margaret Evans, co-founder, mother, biochemist, was not just a woman who built. She was a woman who believed. And belief, like chemistry, is a fragile compound, powerful when stable, but explosive when broken. The frost came early that year in Boulder. By mid-November, the mornings were sharp with cold, the kind that stung the skin and turned breath into misty ribbons. Margaret Evans stood by her office window at Evans Therapeutics, fingers wrapped around a mug of now lukewarm tea. Outside, the aspen trees had lost most of their golden leaves. Inside, she felt something else slipping away, something harder to name. It had started subtly, like a hairline crack on lab glass. The calendar invites stopped appearing in her inbox. Strategy meetings were rescheduled without notice. Budgetary updates came late or not at all. She had chalked it up to clerical errors, glitches in the system. But then came the closed doors, literally and figuratively. One Monday afternoon, Margaret returned from the lab to find her office printer gone. In its place, a note from IT, relocated per new hardware policy. No prior notice. No explanation. And when she checked her digital access to the project management system, 2 folders were grayed out, inaccessible. One of them was EVT R23, the compound she had personally shepherded through 5 years of development. At the weekly executive roundtable, held every Thursday at 10 a.m., Margaret arrived to find the conference room lights off and the chairs still neatly tucked in. She checked the schedule again. No meeting listed. Confused, she headed to the kitchen for coffee and found Mason, the company's newly appointed strategy director and her son Andrew's closest confidant, chatting casually with Lena. "Oh, didn't you hear?" Mason said, surprised. They moved the meeting to Wednesdays now. More efficient for Andrew's calendar. "Who made that decision?" Margaret asked, trying to mask the heat rising in her chest. "Robert and Andrew discussed it last week." Robert, her husband, and Andrew, their son, the ones she had poured her life into building a future for. No one had told her. Margaret returned to her office that day and didn't touch her tea. She just sat there, staring at the nameplate on her desk, Dr. Margaret Evans, co-founder and chief scientific officer. It felt suddenly hollow, like a doorframe to a house that no longer existed. Later that evening, over a silent dinner at home, Margaret set down her fork and asked, "Why wasn't I informed about the new meeting schedule?" Robert didn't look up from his plate. "We figured you were overloaded already. Thought it might be a relief." Andrew, seated across the table, added, "Mom, you've been carrying the company for decades. Maybe it's time to let us take on more. You've earned a rest." There was no malice in his tone. That somehow made it worse. "A rest," she repeated. "Without a conversation? Without a choice?" "Let's not make this emotional," Robert said, pushing his vegetables around. "You've always said the work should speak for itself." Margaret pushed her chair back. "It has. But apparently no one's listening." That night, she couldn't sleep. The house, once a sanctuary, felt foreign. Every photo on the wall, every award tucked into the bookshelf, reminded her of the years she had given to something that now seemed to be moving forward without her. The next morning, Margaret called Carla Reyes, her longtime friend and intellectual property attorney. "I need to talk," she said, her voice thin. Carla invited her over immediately. They met at Carla's home office, nestled in a quiet neighborhood of North Boulder. It was filled with books, plants, and the warm scent of cinnamon tea. Carla listened without interrupting as Margaret recounted everything: the locked files, the missing invites, the sudden vacation talk from her own husband and son. "I want to check something," Carla said as she opened her laptop. "Do you still have access to your patent files?" Margaret nodded and logged into her corporate account. After a few failed login attempts, she frowned. "I had full access until last month," she murmured. Carla took over. After some digging, her brow furrowed. "Margaret, the patents are still legally in your name, thank God. But it looks like internal corporate documents were updated to classify them under shared operational control. That shouldn't be possible without your consent. Are you saying they changed my status internally to strip access to my own work?" "I'm saying that's exactly what they did." Margaret sat back in her chair, her pulse pounding in her ears. "I spent nights nursing Andrew while running spectrometer tests. I wrote those formulae by hand before we had funding for proper software. Robert used to say he couldn't make sense of my notebooks but trusted they held gold. Now he's locking me out." Carla's voice was firm but gentle. "This isn't just about business anymore. It's about power. They're positioning the company for succession, and they've decided you're no longer part of the plan." The words settled like stone in her stomach. Back at the office the next day, Margaret tried again to enter the EVT R23 folder. Still locked. She reached out to IT and was met with evasive replies. "It's part of a broader access protocol restructuring," they claimed. But she knew what was really happening. On Thursday morning, Margaret approached Andrew outside the break room. "Why can't I access the EVT R23 files?" she asked. Andrew looked startled. "We're trying to consolidate project oversight. It's just temporary. You didn't consult me. We didn't think it would be a problem." "You didn't think it would be a problem to deny me access to the compound I designed?" Andrew looked away. "Dad said we needed to streamline decision-making." Margaret stepped back. The silence between them stretched until it snapped. "You mean remove me from it?" "Mom, it's not personal." But that was the problem. It was personal. It was painfully, intimately personal. This wasn't just a company. This was her life's work. Her name was etched on the first blueprint, on the original prototype, on the foundational patents. She had stayed up through viral seasons and flu outbreaks, skipped anniversaries, foregone sabbaticals. For what? To be quietly erased? That weekend, she opened an old wooden box buried in her closet, one filled with lab notebooks dating back to 1987. In it were sketches of the original molecule structure that would become EVT12, the drug that launched the company. Notes in Robert's handwriting, coffee stains, crayon scribbles from when Lena had wanted to be like Mommy. Margaret ran her fingers across the ink, remembering one night when Andrew, then just 12, had asked, "Why do you work so much, Mom?" She had answered, "Because people out there are in pain, and I want to make something that helps." He had nodded and said, "That's kind of like a superpower." Now, that same boy was helping push her out of the company she built with that very superpower. And yet she wasn't angry. Not fully. Not yet. More than anything, she felt grief. The slow, aching grief of being displaced by the very people she had hoped to empower. But grief has a way of becoming clarity. And as Margaret looked over those notebooks, she realized something. They could lock her out of the building. They could block her emails. They could even strip her title. But they couldn't unwrite what she had created. Nor could they understand it the way she did. The why behind each compound. The nuance behind every calibration. The instinct built from decades in the lab. They could steal the steering wheel, but they didn't know how to drive the car. And that, she knew, was where her power still lived. The boardroom was too bright. The artificial overhead lights cast a pale hue over the polished mahogany table, making the air feel sterile, almost surgical. Margaret Evans sat at her usual seat, third chair from the end, near the window overlooking the snow-dusted hills of Boulder. She had chosen that seat for years, preferring the subtle sense of space and light. It was in many ways her quiet corner of control. Today, though, everything felt off. The agenda had arrived with no context, just executive realignment discussion. A meeting scheduled on short notice, set for 8:30 a.m. sharp, with all board members required. No one had greeted her in the hallway like usual. The air was taut with restraint, with the kind of politeness that masks discomfort. She should have known. Robert entered the room first, not with the warmth of her husband, but with the professional distance of a CEO in control. His silver hair was combed back precisely, and he wore the navy suit she had bought him for their 35th anniversary. The symbolism didn't escape her. It wasn't for her anymore. It was for power. Andrew followed close behind, crisp and confident in a charcoal suit, carrying a leather binder embossed with his initials. He didn't make eye contact. That, more than anything, tightened the knot in her chest. The rest of the board members filtered in, some longtime allies, some new blood she'd barely had time to mentor. Margaret offered polite nods. Most returned them quickly, uncomfortably. They knew. She didn't yet, but they did. The meeting began with formalities. Quarterly earnings. Expansion targets. Market projections. It was almost insulting, the way they tiptoed around the storm. Then Robert cleared his throat. As we look toward the future of Evans Therapeutics, he began, not meeting her gaze, we must consider how our leadership evolves to meet new industry demands. Margaret's fingers curled slightly on the table. She had written those very words in past vision statements. Now they were being used against her. Robert continued, effective immediately, Margaret will be transitioning into retirement. Andrew will assume the role of CEO, guiding us into our next phase. There was no warning, no conversation, no acknowledgement of her 4 decades of work. Just a clinical announcement dressed in business language, like a scalpel slipped beneath the ribs. She looked around the room. Lena avoided her eyes entirely, staring intently at her notepad. Carla, her friend and legal counsel who had helped draft Margaret's first patent, sat stiff, lips pressed in a line. And Andrew, her son. Her Andrew. He didn't smile. Didn't speak. Just stared at the binder like it held the future he was promised. Robert pushed a folder across the table. We've prepared a generous retirement package. Full benefits. An honorary title. We'd like to celebrate your legacy publicly next month, in coordination with the annual shareholder address. Margaret didn't touch the folder. Her voice, when it came, was even, sharp, deliberate. When did you all decide this? Robert hesitated. This has been in discussion for a few months. We didn't want to distract you from the current trials. You mean the trials I designed? She interrupted, voice still calm but edged with steel. There was silence. I see, she said softly, her hands folding neatly in her lap. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She didn't beg for clarity or compromise. She simply said one word, understood. But inside, something cracked. And not like glass, which shatters in clean lines. It cracked like bone, deep and painful and slow. That evening, Margaret sat in the garage, surrounded by boxes labeled Lab Archive, 1992 to 1999, EVT-12 drafts, Lena's school projects. It was where she'd kept the parts of herself that didn't fit neatly into the lab or the boardroom. The garage had always been her first lab. She'd brewed her earliest compound formulas there, using old kitchen mixers and salvaged glassware from university surplus auctions. She could still remember Andrew as a boy, holding her pipette with both hands like it was a lightsaber. "Is this going to save someone, Mom?" he had asked once, eyes wide. "That's the plan," she'd said, ruffling his hair. She sat on the cement floor now, knees pulled to her chest, as the weight of the day pressed on her ribs. Her family, the people she had bled and sacrificed for, had removed her like a malfunctioning piece of equipment. There hadn't even been a thank you. Margaret pulled out a folder from one of the boxes. It was yellowed with time. Inside were handwritten notes from the first clinical iteration of EVT-12, the compound that had not only saved lives but launched the company's reputation. Her handwriting filled every inch of the pages, curved and neat, annotated with careful measurements, adjustments, and sketches. She remembered staying up until dawn calculating the right dosage to minimize toxicity. No one else knew what those annotations meant anymore. Not Robert. Not Andrew. Not even Lena. She was not just being removed. She was being forgotten. The next morning, Margaret didn't go to the office. Instead, she met Carla at a quiet cafe near Chautauqua Park. The winter sun stretched long shadows across the wooden floors as they sipped coffee and spoke in hushed tones. "They blindsided me," Margaret finally said. Carla nodded solemnly. "I know. I'm sorry. They offered me a golden retirement cage. No consultation. Just an envelope." "You don't have to sign it," Carla said. "They've overstepped. Legally, ethically." "I don't want revenge," Margaret interrupted. "I want to reclaim what's mine." Carla leaned in. "Then we start with the patents." Margaret nodded. "They think I'm done. They think I'm out." A long pause. "I'm not." Carla smiled for the first time. "Then let's make sure they remember exactly who built this empire." That night, Margaret returned home to find a printed version of the board announcement in her mailbox, as if it were some kind of ceremonial notice. She didn't open it. Instead, she walked out onto the back deck, wrapped in a heavy wool sweater, and looked up at the sky. It was crystal clear, the stars sharp and still in the deep January night. There was a peace in that moment, a point of stillness. This, she thought, is the moment before the storm turns. She had been betrayed. But she was not broken. And tomorrow she would begin again, not with vengeance, but with truth. With knowledge. With the very same quiet force that had built Evans Therapeutics from a folding table in her basement to a nationally respected institution. They had underestimated her. They had mistaken kindness for weakness, patience for passivity, grace for surrender. But Margaret Evans had built her life molecule by molecule. And now, she would rebuild her place, not in the shadows of a title they stripped, but in the undeniable legacy of what she had created. 2 weeks after the boardroom betrayal, the hum inside Evans Therapeutics had shifted, from confident buzz to anxious static. Phones rang longer. Emails took hours, not minutes, to be returned. The lab's main production line sat idle. No one said it outright, but Margaret Evans' absence had turned from a quiet vacancy to a gaping wound. And she knew it. But she wasn't smiling. This wasn't revenge. This was clarity. Margaret hadn't spoken to Robert or Andrew since the meeting. She had left the boardroom with nothing but the envelope they pushed across the table and a fire smoldering behind her composed silence. What they didn't realize, what they underestimated, was not her ability to fight, but her refusal to be erased. The counterattack didn't come in anger. It came in precision. With Carla Reyes by her side, Margaret drafted a cease and desist letter invoking her legal ownership of 3 cornerstone patents, compounds directly tied to the company's current product line. The patents, long licensed to Evans Therapeutics, had been assumed secure under internal agreements. What Robert and Andrew failed to anticipate was that those agreements dissolved the moment they terminated her role without cause. Carla's legal notice was direct, unemotional, but devastatingly effective. Effective immediately, Dr. Margaret Evans revokes licensing permission for the use of patent numbers 882113B, 893776C, and 900155F pending renegotiation. All manufacturing, distribution, and research based on these compounds must cease to avoid legal breach. The letter was sent at 9:03 a.m. on a Monday. By noon, the company's legal team called for an emergency meeting. By Tuesday, the West Coast Hospital Network, Sierra Regional Health, froze a multi-million-dollar contract, citing concerns over intellectual property disputes. Their clause for inventor involvement had been triggered by Margaret's forced removal. 3 more hospitals followed suit by the week's end. By Wednesday, line engineers, those who had worked under Margaret's direct supervision for years, began resigning. She built these systems, one wrote in an exit interview. If she's out, we have no faith they'll be maintained properly. By Thursday, production on EVT-12 came to a halt. And by Friday, Robert finally called. Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she met Carla at her downtown office. They sat across a mahogany desk in a quiet room filled with law books, but the energy between them was alive, strategic, calm, empowered. They didn't just cut you out of a business, Carla said. They cut you out of your own creation. But now they feel it. I didn't want this, Margaret murmured, her fingers tracing the edge of a legal brief. No, but you needed this moment. A beat passed. I'm not going back just to be tolerated, Margaret said finally. I'm going back to redefine my place. This company isn't just a legacy. It's an extension of who I am. And I won't allow it to be twisted into something I don't recognize. The formal negotiation meeting was set for the following Monday. A neutral third-party venue was chosen, a conference suite in a quiet boutique hotel on the edge of town. Margaret arrived early, wearing a navy blue blazer and the same pearl earrings she'd worn to the company's first investor presentation 35 years ago. She wasn't here for nostalgia. She was here to correct the narrative. Robert arrived first. His face was worn, the lines around his eyes deeper than she remembered. Not tired from age, but from avoidance. Andrew entered next, looking every bit the executive. Tailored suit, polished shoes. But his confidence was different now. Brittle. Across the polished table, the lawyer representing the company offered a tight smile. Thank you for coming, Dr. Evans. Our goal today is to find a mutually beneficial resolution. Margaret nodded once. My goal is clarity. Let's begin. The lawyer began with formalities, citing contracts, projections, and the impact of her actions. We acknowledge the current disruption. But Dr. Evans, the company believes a transitional consultant role may satisfy your concerns while allowing operations to resume. Carla spoke first. Dr. Evans is not seeking temporary reintegration. She seeks recognition as an essential, co-equal force behind Evans Therapeutics. That includes fair compensation for her intellectual property and an active leadership role. Andrew finally broke his silence. Mom, we're in trouble. But this doesn't have to escalate further. Can't we just work something out? Margaret turned her gaze toward him. Unflinching. I asked for a conversation, she said, voice soft but resolute. Before you shut me out. Before you locked my files. Before your father read a prepared statement about my retirement. You both made your choice. Mom, we were trying to protect the company, Andrew replied. You've always had strong control, sometimes too strong. We thought, maybe it was time for new leadership. She exhaled. Leadership doesn't mean removal, she said. It means evolution. I've never been afraid of change, Andrew. I've led it. Robert's voice broke in. Then what do you want, Margaret? Her answer was immediate. Equal ownership of the company's active research. A restructured executive board with shared decision-making authority. Retroactive compensation for the years my intellectual property was undervalued. And official recognition of my continuing leadership, not as a relic of the past, but as the scientific mind this company still relies on. Silence. You think I'm difficult, she continued, eyes sweeping the room. But difficulty built the medicines you sell. It built the trust your clients have. And it built the systems you're now watching collapse. She stood slowly, placing a stack of documents on the table. These are the original notes for EVT-12 and EVT-14. The handwritten formulations. The personal lab annotations. There are protocols in here no one else understands. Not because I hoarded knowledge, but because I was the only one willing to learn everything. She looked at her husband. I gave up tenure, stability, time with my children, to build this dream with you. Then to Andrew. And I raised you not to take over what I made, but to protect its integrity. A long pause. Then, if you think I'm replaceable, go ahead. Try. That evening, Margaret drove to the foothills just outside of Boulder. She parked at the overlook where she and Robert used to sit during the early years of the company, eating sandwiches, planning their future, sketching product roadmaps on napkins. She watched the lights of the city blink below. A lifetime of sacrifice glittering in miniature. She didn't cry. She felt whole. For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt the storm inside her settle, not because it had passed, but because she had learned to navigate it. She wasn't just returning to her company. She was returning to herself. A full year had passed since Margaret Evans was quietly removed from the company she helped build. But in that year, through silence, resolve, and clarity, she had rewritten her ending. Not with vengeance. Not with bitterness. But with purpose. The bitter January of the boardroom betrayal had faded into a season of rebuilding. What began as scorched earth slowly became fertile again, first within her, then around her. Margaret didn't return to Evans Therapeutics, despite being offered a revised role weeks after her legal counter. The title no longer mattered. The corner office didn't tempt her. The legacy she had once feared losing wasn't tied to her position, but to her impact. Instead, Margaret founded something new. Evans Legacy Lab, a non-profit biomedical research institute located just a few miles from the original company headquarters. The building was modern, sustainable, and filled not with corporate suits but with ideas. Walls lined with whiteboards and molecular models. Laughter in hallways. Late-night strategy sessions fueled by coffee and conviction. Margaret was no longer a C-suite executive. She was something more powerful, a mentor. She worked side by side with young researchers, many of whom had admired her from afar and now called her Drive E. She hosted weekly roundtables not just on science, but on ethics, leadership, and navigating betrayal without losing your integrity. And on most mornings, Margaret arrived early, long before the lab buzzed to life. She walked the quiet halls, touched the edge of the clean room glass, and smiled. It wasn't just the sound of centrifuges or the scent of ethanol that made her feel alive. It was knowing she still had more to give. Her favorite space in the lab was a modest conference room with a long table and walls made of glass that opened to the trees. On the back wall hung a framed photo, her holding the first vial of EVD12, the compound that changed everything. Not for glory, not for ego, but as a reminder that one person's belief in science, and in people, could ripple outward for decades. One day, a young postdoc named Julian knocked on her door. "I read your paper on targeted delivery systems for microtumors," he said shyly. "It was kind of why I went into this field." Margaret looked up from her notes and smiled. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. "Would you look at my model?" he asked. She didn't hesitate. She pulled her chair beside him, rolling up her sleeves. "Show me what you've got." That moment, leaning over data, collaborating without hierarchy, that was her new boardroom. And she was exactly where she was meant to be. Meanwhile, change rippled through the very family that had once cast her aside. Robert, after months of silence and stiff meetings, finally requested a one-on-one. They met at the botanical gardens in early spring, where tulips pushed through the thawing ground. He wore no suit. Just an old sweater she'd knit him in their first year of marriage. "I'm stepping down from the board," he said quietly. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "I should have done it a year ago," he continued. "But pride, well, you know how that works." She nodded slowly. "I miss us," he said. "Not just the company. I miss the woman who built that first lab with a baby strapped to her chest and a vision no one else could see." Margaret blinked against the sharp sunlight. "She's still here, just no longer willing to be invisible." "I know, and I'm sorry. I thought letting go meant making room. But I pushed you out instead of stepping back." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't need to. That conversation wasn't closure, it was beginning. Andrew came next. One morning, he walked into Evans' legacy lab unannounced, holding 2 coffee cups. He looked nervous, like a boy about to confess to breaking a window. I messed up. Margaret set aside her journal and looked up. I was scared, he admitted. Scared that I could never fill your shoes. And instead of asking for your help, I tried to replace you. She said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. I miss your voice, he continued. Not just as a mother, as the mind behind this whole damn thing. Would you consider being an advisor to our innovation team? Not to report to me, just to guide us. We're lost without that. Margaret sipped the coffee. It was the way she liked it, black, no sugar. I'm not stepping backward, she said firmly. I know, he said. Just sideways. She nodded once. I'll think about it. And she did. Not because she needed the power, but because healing a legacy meant more than reclaiming space. It meant teaching the next generation how to respect what built them. Lena had always been the quiet one. She never spoke against her mother, but she didn't defend her either. Caught between loyalty and career, she drifted in the storm. But one evening, after attending a lecture Margaret gave on women in science, Lena waited until the crowd cleared. That was beautiful, she whispered. Margaret looked at her daughter, older now, more thoughtful. You've grown into someone strong. Lena's voice cracked. I should have stood up for you. You didn't know how. I do now, she said, taking her mother's hand. And I want to be part of whatever comes next. Margaret nodded. You already are. Then came the ceremony. Evans Therapeutics' 40th anniversary gala. The invitation arrived in a cream-colored envelope with a handwritten note. Please join us in celebrating the foundation you helped build. She thought long about attending. But in the end, it wasn't about them. It was about the people whose lives were changed because she never gave up. It was about the lab techs, the patients, the young women watching, wondering if their voices would ever be heard. That night, the hall shimmered with soft light and crystal chandeliers. Executives mingled. Glasses clinked. And then the CEO, Andrew, stepped on stage. There's someone here tonight who doesn't need an introduction, he began. Because she's in every treatment we develop, every product we deliver, every story we tell. He looked toward her. She is our foundation. And our future. Please welcome Dr. Margaret Evans. Applause erupted as Margaret stepped up, steady and sure. Not in spite of her age, but because of it. She approached the podium, took a breath, looked out across the faces, some familiar, some new. I'm not here tonight to reclaim a title, she began, or to dwell on what was taken. I'm here because I never left. My fingerprints are still on the work. My heart is still in the mission. She paused, her voice softening. I was told I was done, that I had no more to offer. But value doesn't retire. It doesn't fade with age or get boxed into an honorary plaque. Value evolves. She looked toward the young scientists in the back of the room. And if you're sitting in this room, feeling overlooked, sidelined, silenced, don't believe the lie that your worth has an expiration date. Stand up. Speak up. Start again if you must. She smiled then. I was never forgotten. I just needed to stand in the right place to be seen again. The room rose to its feet. But Margaret didn't bask in it. She simply stepped back, her place in the spotlight not a claim, but a reminder. That true legacy isn't in what you keep. It's in what you pass on.